Righty-ho, folks, let's focus on Gerald's confession. Now, remember that Gerald is the archetypal upper-class gent. And by that, he reflects the flaws of that particular part of society, but also that particular idea of gender. He is, in his masculinity, he is selfish, he is arrogant, he is belittling to women, and he believes that he is autonomous in everything that he does. He has this sense of righteousness and complacency that is there because he's a man, and also because he's a man at the top of the social hierarchy. Righty-ho. So let's see where we go from here. Okay. First thing then, when the inspector makes it clear that Gerald is implicated in the relationship between Daisy or Eva, Gerald says, "Where did you get the idea that I did know her?" Now, again, that idea that he's being defensive, he's being hesitant. We've known from the end of Act 1 that he's involved with Daisy or Eva. Sheila has known that. We ended at Act 1 at that point of tension, and yet he's still trying to cover his tracks. He still wants to maintain some sense of dignity, some sense of control in a situation that is beyond his control now. And then it's almost as if he capitulates to the inspector. He says, "All right, if you must have it." If you must have it. He's not willing in this process. He's being forced into this process, and you can see that in the sort of the arrogance of what he's saying and the incivility. Well, if you must have it, rather than an honest approach to the situation, which is something that we had with Sheila. I met her first sometime in March last year in the Stalls bar at the Palace. I mean, the Palace Music Hall here in Brumley. Sheila's little quip there, "Well, we didn't think you meant Buckingham Palace." Again, it shows a level of immaturity. If I can fit that in. Oh, I can't. It doesn't even look like a maturity, but you know what I mean. A level of immaturity with Sheila there. But after all, remember that this is, for Sheila, such an eye-opening experience. Even though she had that sense of mistrust, even though she knew there must be something in the subtext in Act 1, now she's actually being faced with the truth at her own engagement party. So yes, she's bitter. Yes, she's sardonic. Yes, she's a little bit immature, but perhaps she's entitled to all of those feelings right now at this moment. And Gerald says to Sheila, "Thanks, you're going to be a great help." Again, a level of immaturity from him. You're obviously going to hate it, so why on earth don't you leave us? And again, that idea that he wants her out of the room. We've had that before at the start of Act 2, where he said that she's had a tiring day. But getting Sheila to leave the room is less about Sheila than it is about Gerald and his ability to try and maintain some dignity. He doesn't want to be brought crashing down in front of Sheila. Remember, you've got the idea of status as an upper class gent, but also the idea of gender. He's the man in charge. He picked the ring. He's the one that is dominant in this relationship. But that dominance is going to dissipate if he unburdens himself here in front of the inspector, which is what he's going to be forced to do. And Sheila says, "Nothing would induce me. I want to understand exactly what happens when a man says he's so busy at the work that he can hardly find time to come and see the girl he's supposed to be in love with. I wouldn't miss it for the world." I think that's an important thing. I want to understand. Well, that's really exactly what Sheila's trying to do. She's trying to understand herself and her actions, and she's trying to understand the world that she lives in, and she's trying to understand Gerald. She's not trying to judge. Okay, that's not what she's trying to do. She's not trying to judge the way others have and the way that others will judge Gerald here. Mrs. Burling's going to say that it's disgusting, and it's just disgusting to her, this affair. But Sheila's not there to judge. She's there to understand. And that's a new thing with Sheila. Okay, so the inspector says with authority, "Yes, Mr. Croft, in the Stars of the Palace Bar," bringing him back to the issue at hand, rather than being lost in perhaps the pettiness between himself and Sheila there. "I happened to look in one night after a long, dull day. As the show wasn't very bright, I went down to the bar for a drink. It's a favourite haunt of women of the town." Now, there's a couple of things here. He looked in after a long, dull day. So this idea that after a long dull day of work, what does he do? He seeks out the women of the town. Now again, there you've got another euphemism. Oh, there we go. Do you remember that you had Berlin who used the euphemism for prostitution? What did she do? Get into trouble, go onto the streets? Well, here you have, again, Berlin's little parallel character, Gerald, his true son and heir in some respects, using euphemisms to cover the same ground, that ground about female sexuality. So he's had a long, dull day. What does he do? He goes to the place where the prostitutes are because he's had a long, dull day. Now, that smacks of not only the idea of how Gerald sees gender, but also how Gerald feels entitled to relieve his long, dull day through a nice little bit of female exploitation here. Okay, a nice little bit of female exploitation. Women, prostitutes, women who are so desperate that they would have to sell themselves. They are really distractions for people like Gerald, who have had long tiring days and need to be relieved of that stress. But again, it's just that idea about Gerald's feeling of entitlement. Well, why shouldn't I use their services? Why shouldn't I pay? Why shouldn't I exploit them? And Mrs. Berlin says women of the town. And again, look at the innocence of Mrs. Berlin in some respects. She questions that euphemism. Yes, but I see no point in mentioning the subject, especially. Again, that idea that this exploitation of women by men happens all the time, but let's cover it over. Let's not talk about it. Let's just leave that for the smoking room conversations of gents like Berlin and Gerald. And Mr. Berlin again, now we've talked about what he's like as a parent. Well, obviously he doesn't want Sheila to be within earshot of some really salacious information. He tries to cover that over for her, indicating Sheila. Wouldn't it be much better if Sheila didn't listen to the story at all, said Mrs. Berlin. And then Sheila says, but you're forgetting I'm supposed to be engaged to the hero of it. Again, that idea that everybody's trying to push Sheila to the sidelines, but she wants to stand her ground. She needs to know, she needs to understand. Go on, Gerald, you went into the bar, which is a favourite haunt of women of the town. So she wants to know more. Again, not to judge him, but that key thing to understand. I like the idea that she refers to Gerald as a hero, because Gerald is his own hero. That's how he sees himself, and Sheila can recognise that. Gerald says to Sheila, I'm glad I amuse you. Again, there's that bitterness there because he feels his lack of dignity. Not that he feels bad for what he's done to Sheila or bad for what he's done to Daisy or Eva, but bad because he feels that sense that his dignity is being attacked. The inspector is sharp. Come along, Mr. Croft, what happened? No time for him to wallow in his interest in his self-awareness, but the inspector is trying to get Mr. Croft to get to the heart of the matter, to acknowledge his responsibility, acknowledge his guilt. I didn't propose to stay long down there. I hate those hard-eyed, doe-faced women. Now, just look there at the metaphors that he uses to describe the prostitutes. Hard-eyed and doe-faced. Those metaphors are important because what they tell us is that Gerald is aware of how prostitution and a life of such desperation affects these women. They become ugly. They become almost an inhuman description of them. Hard-eyed, that idea that they're almost numb to emotion. Doe-faced. Now again, that suggests some sense of physical, not necessarily deformity, but the effects of their lifestyle are seen physically, that it's perhaps the moral corruption of what they're doing is made apparent in this sort of physical corruption of their face. And yet, aware of these things, he still chooses to take that road. He still chooses to exploit them further. You know, you could understand. No, well, you couldn't really understand. But perhaps you could say, well, look, if the men were not aware of how deeply affected these women were by the prostitution that they had to resort to, then perhaps that could excuse their behaviour and mitigate their behaviour. But no, Gerald is aware, and he criticises them for it. He criticises them for their unappealingness, despite the fact that he and men like him are responsible for the women being in a situation like this. And then he says, but then I noticed a girl who looked quite different. She was very pretty, soft brown hair, big dark eyes. Again, that idea that she's untouched by the moral corruption of prostitution because she's new to it. Eva would become hard-eyed and dough-faced if her life continued along that road. The road that has been, I suppose, paid for her by the actions of Burley and by Sheila up until this point. And again, this idea that Priestley is presenting Eva, representation of the working classes, in such a positive light. She's beautiful, she's fresh, she's a victim. This is how she is now. And what capitalism will do is this. It will turn her into a hard-eyed, dough-faced woman. But of course, she doesn't live that long. Gerald breaks off. My God. And the inspector says, what's the matter? Distressed. Sorry. I suddenly realised, taken in properly, that she's dead. Now, again, look at the fractured syntax here. If you want to be critical of Gerald, and my heavens, you would never get tired of being critical of the man. If you wanted to be critical of him, that's fine. But if you wanted to give him some level of sympathy, you could say that the fractured syntax here does reflect how emotionally disturbed he is when he realises what he's lost, when he realises the situation that Eva was in. So there is that emotional attachment. The same sort of emotional attachment that Sheila was able to make when she placed herself and Eva side by side, when she thought about how horrible things had been for Eva, and yet Sheila had been so happy that night. Or also that sense of equality and emotional attachment that Eric has when he says, well, why shouldn't these girls try for higher wages? We try for higher prices or profits. So the point being is that Gerald too makes this link to an emotional attachment with Eva, and the fractured syntax makes that obvious there. We could be sympathetic for him in relation to that. That's a saving grace of Gerald that he has that. But the inspector harshly says, yes, she's dead, and we probably between us killed her. So again, the inspector's not giving him any sympathy. All of the inspector's sympathy is for Eva, for the victim. His harshness is there to remind Gerald, well, yes, she is dead, and you're responsible. It's a sort of verbal wake-up call for Gerald. Look at Mrs. Burling there. She says, Sheila, don't talk such nonsense. Again, that idea of her building up a wall, and that wall won't allow any sort of emotional attachment, any sort of responsibility, any recognition that in some ways the lives of the Burlings could have had an impact on the life of someone like Eva. Okay, then the inspector again, prompting Gerald to go on. She looked young and fresh and charming and altogether out of place there. And again, that is that idea of this positivity associated with Eva. Priestley is presenting her as some idea of perfection. And also you've got the idea of the juxtaposition between young, fresh and charming and the hard-eyed, dough-faced women. The idea of this is how they start, and the hard, dough-faced women is how they'll end up. That's how society, I suppose, treats them. That's how society churns them up in their pathetic and desperate attempts to live in a world that just cannot tolerate them and their poverty. You've also got this idea that she wasn't enjoying herself. Old Joe McGarity, half drunk and goggle-eyed, had wedged her into a corner with his obscene fat carcass. And now old Joe McGarity is a leading figure within the society. He's an older man, so he's a council representative. But look at the harshness of Gerald's language here. Obscene fat carcass. half-drunk, goggle-eyed. So these figures of authority are actually, in relation to the language used here, they're corrupt, they're morally corrupt. Gerald can see that. Gerald was resenting the approaches of old Joe McGarry to this fresh, young, charming Eva. He sees that as disgusting, yet he doesn't see what he does to Eva as disgusting. Again, perhaps there's this lack of self-awareness. Mrs. Burling cuts in, there's no need to be disgusting. Again, that word that she'll use further on. Are you sure you do you mean Alderman McGarry? And again, Mrs. Burling shows her naivety. You know, woman of the town, she questions the idea that an alderman can actually be disreputable is something that seems quite new to her. And Gerald says, of course, he's a notorious womanizer as well as being one of the worst sots and rogues in Brumley. And this idea that dignity and respectability is just superficial. It's superficial for Alderman McGarry. It's superficial for the Burlings. They appear to be one particular thing, and a nice family, but they're not. And again, think back to the very start with the idea of their home. It appears to be rich and comfortable, well off, the sort of show home of a middle class gent, but it is without personality. It is without emotional attachment. This idea that there is a facade here. Can you see that? FACADE. That there's a facade being built up around these people and the way that they live their lives. But once you chip away at the facade, then you see the corrupt nature within. And that's what Mrs. Burling does here with Alderman McGarry. Poor Mrs. Burling is staggered. Really, I must say, we're learning something tonight. Lovely wee bit of irony there. She learns nothing. Throughout this entire night, she learns nothing. And they have that idea too that even Sheila, who's meant to be young and immature, even she's aware of the disreputable nature of these figures in society. You know, she says coolly that she's known a girl who's had her had to escape with her blouse being torn. Again, this idea of gender and how masculinity sees itself as, in some ways, entitled to oppress, entitled to intimidate, entitled to manhandle femininity. That idea that Eva is at the bottom of the social pile, but even more so, she's at the bottom of the social pile and she's a woman. So she's the weakest of vessels in that respect. So Gerald, the girl, saw me looking and then gave a glance as a cry for help. And again, that appeals to the hero, this idea that Gerald has of himself as a hero. So he went over and that he rescued her. She agreed at once. You have this idea of Gerald paints himself in this particular light as the white knight on the charger, rescuing this young, fresh and beautiful damsel. And the inspector gets straight to it with, where did you go? We went to the county hotel, which I knew would be quiet at that time of night. Now, my question is, how did he know that the hotel would be quiet at that time of night, unless he frequents that hotel regularly? Remember, he goes to the Palace Bar because he knows that after a long, dull day, that's where the woman of the town will be. And so you get this idea that this hero on his charger who rescues this damsel has an agenda that has been followed previously. The idea that he got to the hotel that he knew would be quiet. She had a port and lemonade, something like that. She wanted to talk. She wanted a little friendliness. It doesn't seem much in this world to want a little friendliness. She'd been shaken by what had happened to her. And again, you have this idea of the vulnerability of Eva. Everything that Gerald is saying makes Eva sound even better, makes her sound flawless in that respect. When Gerald recounts what Eva says, she said, I asked her questions. She told me her name was Daisy Renton, that she'd lost her parents from Brumley. She had a job and lost it because of strikes, said something about the shop. So, you know, Eva is not a victim who wallows in her victimhood. She doesn't She doesn't denounce Burling for what he did, nor does she make any spurious accusations about how she lost her job. Instead, she tells the basics, the facts, but she doesn't dwell upon her victimhood. She's deliberately vague, couldn't get exact details from her. But that idea that she was desperately hard up, and at that moment she was actually hungry. And again, that lets you know that the idea of not being able to feed oneself is what brought her to the haunted woman of the town, how desperate she was. And the inspector says, and then you decided to keep her as your mistress. That idea that this is a plan, that this is an agenda that is very clearly one that has been established before. And the inspector realises that Gerald is exploiting that situation. Even the word choice, you decided to keep her. Ownership, possession, the idea that he's in control. Mrs. Burling says, what? Because of course she lives in her little bubble. And Sheila says, of course, mother. It was obvious from the start. Go on, Gerald. Don't mind, mother. Now, look at that. Look how far removed from, well, we didn't think you meant Buckingham Palace. It shows this level of maturity that Sheila has. Again, not to judge, but to understand. And Gerald is steady. He's perhaps rocked by the fact that he's being honest here. And also that idea that he's been honest not in front of hysterical women, but in front of a woman who very matter-of-factly accepts the truth. Discovered that night 2 nights later, we met not accidentally this time, that she hadn't a penny, that she'd been turned out. And then you have the idea that it was clear that he could keep her in the rooms of his friend. Moved her into the rooms. I made her keep some money. Carefully to the inspector, I want you to understand that I didn't install her there so that I could make love to her. Now again, look at that. He speaks carefully to the inspector. He doesn't speak carefully to Sheila. He doesn't justify himself or try to justify himself to Sheila, but he does so to the inspector. And why is that? Does he think that because as a man, therefore he really only has to be responsible to other men? Does he think so little of Sheila and how she's feeling at this time that he doesn't want to try and, provide mitigating circumstances for what he did, but he speaks to the inspector? The other thing it could be in relation to is that the power of the inspector has to dominate and control, and Gerald feels that he has to in some way pander to the inspector or ingratiate himself with the inspector or make the inspector understand. He says, I didn't ask for anything in return. And that makes me think of the quotation, better to ask for the world than take it. And that idea that he didn't ask her for anything, but it was very clear that she would have to give something back. So he may not have asked it, but this was a bargain, and both sides knew what was actually being sold here. The inspector says, I see. Not in agreement. He just, I see, I understand how this would work. Yes, but why are you saying that to him? You ought to be saying that to me. That's what Sheila says again in relation to the why is he making all his points to the inspector. And Gerald says, I suppose I ought to really. I'm sorry, Sheila. Somehow, I know somehow he makes you. Linking again to that idea, the gravitas of the inspector, that he has a way of just bringing the truth out. I suppose it was inevitable. Yep, it very clearly was. She was young and pretty and warm-hearted, intensely grateful. I became at once the most important person in her life. And that idea that she was all of those things, and you exploited them. You exploited her youth and her prettiness and the fact that she was intensely grateful. Were you in love with her? Said the inspector. And Sheila says, that's what I was going to say. Burling says, I really must protest. And you've got that wonderful moment where Burling doesn't protest about the idea of talking about mistress, but he protests about love. He protests when the idea of love and genuine emotion is brought in. And again, that makes you think that for Burling, where does he value love? Where is it within his, I suppose, within his moral outlook? It's not very clear how he values it. You have the idea that the inspector turns very sharply on Burling. Now, again, if we want to be sympathetic to Burling, he wants to protect his daughter. He doesn't want his young girl, his daughter, being dragged into this business. And the inspector says very sharply, your daughter isn't living on the moon. She's here in Brumley too. That idea that Sheila needs to be made aware of what's happening in her world. And of course we know that Sheila understands much more than her own mother about what's happening in this world. Sheila says yes, and it was I who had the girl turned out of her job. Again, that idea of her taking responsibility. I'm not a child. I have a right to know, were you in love with her, Gerald? That's a very mature question for Sheila to ask. Were you in love with her? The bitterness, the immaturity, the hostility, all of those things have taken second place to the idea of Sheila wanting to understand. Gerald hesitating. It's hard to say. I didn't feel about her as she felt about me. And again, the subtext here is that perhaps Gerald was in some way in love with her, but he can't admit that. He cannot admit that. Why? Is it because Sheila's in the room? No. Is it because that he, as an upper class gent, couldn't admit to having feelings, emotional attachments to a working class prostitute? Well, of course it is. Look at that huge, big social divide. That would debase him, that would belittle him, that would be an affront to his dignity. Where would his respectability be if he were to be in love with a working class prostitute? So, of course, that hesitancy that you have there, it's the awkwardness, because he cannot articulate the truth of the situation. I didn't feel about her as she felt about me. He doesn't deny that he was in love with her, but instead what he does is he tries to put the onus upon her feelings rather than his, because it would be perfectly correct for her as a working class girl to hero worship this upper class gent, but the other way around would be totally unacceptable. And perhaps Sheila senses that, perhaps she senses the dishonesty, because for the first time in quite a while, she goes back to that sarcasm. Of course not, you were the wonderful fairy prince. You must have adored it, Gerald. Now, we've talked a lot about how Sheila and Gerald don't truly understand each other, but there's an insight that Sheila has into Gerald's character, that he is ego-driven. That idea of he sees himself as the hero in his own fairy tale, and also let's give Gerald a little bit of praise here. He acknowledges that, all right, I did for a time, nearly any man would have. So again, that idea that self-awareness is something that's growing within Gerald here during this little episode. That's probably the best thing you've said all night. Look at that. So Sheila, from the sharp sarcasm to what is perhaps a compliment. That's the best thing you've said. At least it's honest. And that's what the confession is about here. It's about honesty. Sheila's confession was about honesty. Burling's confession was honest in relation to the facts, but not honest in relation to Burling accepting who he was as a person. Did you go and see her every night? No, I wasn't telling you a complete lie. Again, that idea about how much responsibility he's going to take, not just for Daisy and how he treated her, but for Sheila and how he treated her as well. We were very busy, but of course I did see a good deal of her. Mrs. Burling says, I don't think we want any further details of this disgusting affair. Second time that she's used the word disgusting. But again, that idea that Mrs. Burling is only thinking about how this impacts upon her and her sensibilities, and Sheila takes authority there, cutting in. I do. Okay, I want the details. Again, not because I want to judge, but because I want to understand. And Gerald says, and you're not going to have any. To Sheila, you've had, that's enough. That the other details are not to be shared. And look at Gerald here. He stands up to Mrs. Burling. It wasn't disgusting. That idea that he in some ways doesn't try to validate the relationship, but tries to take the judgment out of this situation, this judgment that Mrs. Berlin is always too willing to give. And she does that little thing that her husband did. Do you remember during the Stickamithia scene with Berlin and the inspector, when it's my duty to ask questions, and you had that idea that Berlin was using the language of the inspector and it made him sound petty and it made him sound childish. Well, here Mrs. Berlin's doing exactly the same thing. She repeats Gerald's words in a petty and childish way. Well, it's disgusting to me. Third time that she's used the word disgusting, because of course everything is a judgment that everything is a judgment with Mrs. Berling as the arbitrator. She's the judge. That's disgusting. Whereas Sheila's not there to judge Gerald. She's there to understand him. Yes, but after all, you don't come into this, do you, mother? And look at that. That's important. Sheila taking authority. This is my problem. This isn't your problem, mother. And again, this maturity that seems to be developing within Sheila. Is there anything else you want to know that you ought to know? And there's a difference that you want to know and that you ought to know. Remember when he said at the very start, well, if you have to have it, well, ought is different, i.e. it's important for you to know. So it's not just dragging the information out of Gerald, but Gerald has that idea, is there anything else that I need to share with you? And remember, that's one of the reasons why the inspector had that preternatural ability to read Sheila's mind, when he said that she needs to say, because if there's one thing we can share our responsibility. And here Gerald says, is there anything else that you ought to know, i.e. is there anything else that I need to share? And again, that links to a more positive development within Gerald's character during this confession. Gerald tells about how the affair ended. So I broke it off before. How did she take it, says the inspector. And there's a nice little bit of irony here. Gerald says she was very gallant. Now, gallant is usually a word associated with gentlemanly behaviour. And here Gerald says that it was Eva who was very gallant, not Gerald, not the gentleman. But again, another way for Priestley to show this flawlessness, this idea that the working class as represented by Eva are the epitome of goodness, are the epitome of humility, are the epitome of civilization. Sheila says with irony, that was nice for you. And Gerald snaps back, no, it wasn't. That idea that he is emotionally engaged, that there's a sense of hurt there. She told me she'd been happier than she'd ever been before, that she knew it couldn't last, that she didn't blame me at all. I wish to God she had now. Perhaps I'd feel better about it. And again, the emotional attachment, the sense of sorrow, the sense of regret, the sense of guilt, all of those are implied. They're all part of the subtext. He doesn't articulate them expressly, but they're there in the subtext. Now that's important, because when Sheila's talking about her culpability, what she did, she does express her sorrow and guilt. Gerald is there, but it's latent, it's beneath the language. And that might be important because it doesn't last very long. It's not articulated because it's not as sincere as when Sheila was in the same situation as Gerald. Again, that idea of giving her the money, that Eva went to the palace bar, I suppose, to sell herself because she was hungry. And ultimately she did sell herself, but in a different way. She had one client rather than many. That client actually cared for her, but it was still exploitation. It was still that idea that she had no other route to go down other than to sell herself. She may have been emotionally engaged with Gerald, she may have loved him, but he still paid her money. That idea then that where did she go afterwards? The inspector said that she went away for some months to the seaside, and the inspector says she wanted to be alone, to be quiet, to remember what happened between you all. Again, that idea of the tragedy of Eva, that she was so emotionally engaged, that she was so broken-hearted by what had happened with herself and Gerald, that she had to take herself off and contemplate it. The inspector, of course, can illustrate that and provide proof of it through this sort of diary just to make it last longer. But what he does really here is he reflects the tragedy of Daisy's experience to such a point where it does impact upon Gerald. He says gravely, I see that idea that he has been impacted. The words of the inspector have had such an impact upon him. Well, I never saw her again, and that's all I can tell you. That short little brisk statements there. Again, that idea that the emotional attachment that he feels is there. It's beneath the surface. Finally, then you can see again how the confession, how the realization of the way that he has impacted upon Eva's life. It's all there with the broken syntax, the fractured syntax then. As I'm rather more upset by this business, I'd like to go. And so we can feel sympathy for Gerald, and to some extent, because he is emotionally engaged in the situation. And Sheila, just before he goes, says, just in case you forget or decide not to come back, Gerald, I think you better take this with you. And she gives him back the ring. And that's a really important thing for Sheila, because it's about her understanding that the ring is one thing. We've linked it to the materialism that she perhaps felt when she saw it and the way that it sparkled. But also it lets us know that through this journey that she's undergone with the inspector and with Gerald, that marriage is more than a ring. It's more than the sparkles. It has to be about the emotional attachment. The same sort of emotional attachment that has been present in the subtext when Gerald was talking about Eva and how he felt about her and how she felt about him. And Gerald says, well, I was expecting this, not bitterly. Again, that idea of understanding, resigned to the situation, resigned to the fact that what he has done was the wrong thing to do. Now, he's not accepting responsibility for it. He doesn't say the word responsible, but we understand that there must be some sense of responsibility there by the way that he's been so distraught and distressed by the inspector's story. And I really think that this is perhaps one of the greatest progressions that we'll see here from Sheila. I don't dislike you as I did half an hour ago. In fact, in some odd way, I rather respect you more than I've ever done. That idea about learning and understanding. But this is the key thing that Sheila realises. And at least you've been honest. And I believe that you what you told us when you first went to help her, just out of pity. And it was my fault really that she was so desperate. Again, Sheila accepting responsibility. But you and I aren't the same people who sat down to dinner. Now, that's great because it's got a lovely little bit of art. They are better. Both of them are better people. Okay, their relationship might seem broken at this moment in time, but they are better people for it. The people who sat down for dinner were complacent and arrogant and self-absorbed, but the two people who now face each other are people who are on a journey of discovery for them about themselves, and a journey of discovery about their relationship. The terrible thing is that Sheila's going to go on this journey of discovery, and Gerald is only going to go partly there. His confession makes us believe that he is in some ways moving along in step with Sheila, that there is a sense that their idea of responsibility is paralleling or mirroring each other. That's what you think at this moment in time. And that's what you think when Gerald leaves. But as we find out in Act 3, that is not the case. The sincerity of Gerald's feelings is up for debate. Berlin says, now Sheila, I'm not defending him when he quite blatantly is defending him, because remember, Berlin's got a lot to lose if Gerald walks out that door. But you must understand that a lot of young men, and again relate that to gender, the idea that morality is different if you're a man, that you can expect to do things, you can expect to get away with things, your judgments cannot be questioned in the same way that they would be if you were a woman. And Sheila very maturely says, don't interfere. Gerald knows what I mean. and you apparently don't. And again, that gives us this suggestion that Gerald and Sheila mirror each other's feelings of responsibility and awareness, and that's what you hope for, but again that's taken away from you in Act 3. And Gerald says, yes, I know what you mean, but I'm coming back if I may. And you have that hope that Gerald cares for Sheila, not that he just wants a wife, not that he just needs to marry for money, but I'm coming back for you, that there's something about you that makes me want to return. And that marriage for Gerald is an emotional act rather than a materialistic one. And Sheila says, all right. She gives him that hope. She gives him that option that they can learn who they are as people, and that might allow them to grow and redevelop their relationship. Mrs. Burling says, really, I don't know. I think we've come to the end of this wretched business. And again, that word that's so much part of her idiolect and her husband's. And Gerald says, I don't think so. Excuse me. I.e., I don't think we've come to the end of this wretched business. He understands that there is more to come from the inspector. And when Gerald leaves, he goes out and they watch him in silence, and the front door slams. When he leaves a better person than the person who arrived. There's potential there for Gerald. We have hope for Gerald. But what Priestley will do is he will take that hope away in Act 3. And we're left doubting the honesty of Gerald, the sincerity of Gerald. Because remember, Gerald is an archetype. He is the upper class gent. What we believe him to be is not necessarily what he is. And at this moment in time, we believe him to be a man who is regretful, who is sincere, who has, without actually saying it, taken some level of responsibility for his actions. But when he comes back in Act 3, we realise that that regret, that sincerity, and that responsibility, they are all just superficial. That at the heart of Gerald is a selfish, arrogant egotist. And the facade that he has adopted here, whether he truly believes it or not, is but a facade.